just get upset about it. Do you remember when this was like a week-long scandal when Barack Obama wore a tan suit? Remember the days when that was a scandal?
Well, the thing is that because of that, because we've all lived through that, you can't help but think anytime somebody wears a tan suit that it's a signal.
They're just looking for trouble.
Yes.
Rachel, have yourself a great evening. Thank you.
Ali.
All right, I'm Ali Velshi in for Lawrence O'Donnell. Tonight, as we await the Mueller report, one of the people who wrote the rules for the special counsel, Neil Katyal, will join me to discuss why those rules exist and why Donald Trump, as hard as he tries, can't talk or squirm his way out of them. And we have a Democratic presidential candidate tonight. I'll talk policy and politics with former HUD Secretary and Mayor of San Antonio, Julian Castro. Plus, a look at why so many of President Trump's policies are going down to defeat in the nation's courts. But we begin tonight with an increasingly unfocused president picking fights while failing to keep his promises. We saw that in Ohio today. The president flew in for what was in many ways an unofficial 2020 campaign event. The president, of course, won Ohio after promising to bring back manufacturing jobs. Today, he spoke at the country's last factory that makes tanks for the Army in Lima, Ohio. The factory had been on the decline, but it's now growing as a result of the Trump administration's increase in the military budget.
Well, you better love me. I kept this place open. That I can tell you. They said, we're closing it. And I said, no, we're not.
But it only took a few minutes for the president to go off the rails and distract from his own message by launching an unprompted attack on a deceased war hero.
They asked me about a man named John McCain. And if you want that to tell you about it, should I or not? So I have to be honest, I've never liked him much. Hasn't been for me. I've really probably never will. I gave him the kind of funeral that he wanted, which as president I had to approve. I don't care about this. I didn't get thank you. That's okay. We sent him on the way, but I wasn't a fan of John McCain.
I didn't get thank you. But that's okay. The president dedicated almost 5 minutes of his speech to attacking John McCain. It was the president's feuds that seemed to be on his mind the most today, not his economic promises. He did manage to squeak out a few lines about the economy.
It's all about manufacturing, and we're bringing it back in record numbers. We've made some progress. That's why you see these numbers. Look at that chart. Look at that. You don't have to know what's on it. What difference? Look at the line. You don't have to know what the hell is on it. All you know is that's a good line.
Wow. I'd like to know what that's about because we're not bringing manufacturing jobs back in record numbers. Manufacturing jobs have increased slightly, not necessarily due to Trump's policies, but voters in Ohio may not be feeling like the president kept his promise. A poll from Morning Consult shows that Donald Trump's net approval rating in Ohio has fallen by 19 points since he took office in January 2017. That might be due to the fact that some manufacturing jobs are still leaving Ohio. In Lordstown, just 200 miles away from where the president spoke, a General Motors plant is shutting down this month, leaving about 1,600 workers without jobs and the future of the plant uncertain. GM's CEO cited the Trump tariffs, which have cost the company about $1 billion, as a reason for the closure. The president seemed to recognize that closing as a threat to his core support. He spent the week tweeting demands for the plant to reopen. Today he said this about why he wanted that plant to reopen.
Get the discussions going, get it open. Lordstown's a great area. I guess I like it because I won so big there.
Meanwhile, in Washington, the Federal Reserve Chairman gave an economic forecast that was much less optimistic than what the president was saying and what the White House said yesterday.
Data arriving since September suggests that growth is slowing somewhat more than expected. Financial conditions tightened considerably over the fourth quarter. While conditions have eased since then, they remain less supportive of growth than during most of 2018.
But the president's focus seemed elsewhere. Donald Trump began his day with a tweet attacking George Conway, the husband of his advisor, Kellyanne Conway. And he kept that up when he said this about George Conway to reporters.
He's a whack job, there's no question about it, but I really don't know him. I think he's doing a tremendous disservice to a wonderful wife. Kellyanne is a wonderful woman, and I call him Mr. Kellyanne. The fact is that he's doing a tremendous disservice to a wife and family.
All right, joining us now, John Harwood, the editor-at-large for CNBC, and David Leonhardt, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. John, I don't know what Donald Trump gets from attacking John McCain. It's mysterious. He's been going at this for a few days. It's unprompted. Today it was entirely unprompted. He likes to start with, they asked me about John McCain, but in fact today nobody asked him about John McCain.
Ali, everything the president was saying in the clips that you showed underscored the point that George Conway, Kellyanne Conway's husband, has been making the last couple of days, that this is a president who is completely absorbed within himself. You saw him say, you better love me. I saved these jobs here. Maybe I like this area because they voted for me so much. It was not about others. It was about him. The same is true of his obsession with John McCain, who he's fixated on for having voted against the repeal of Obamacare and maybe other things. Maybe John McCain's heroism in Vietnam, who knows? But it is a bizarre fixation for the president at a time when, even though the economy is slowing, as Jay Powell indicated, and that it is not poised to deliver the kind of growth that the White House says it's going to, it still is growing, and that is the, among all the things that the president could be talking about, that would probably be the most constructive for him.
You know, David, earlier today at that stakeout before the president got on the helicopter to leave for Ohio, he made another comment, and he was talking about the Mueller investigation, in which he said, I don't get it, and my voters don't get it. So more than 2 years in, the president seems concerned with himself, his base, and his voters, not the country.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, at this point, what's so difficult with all these statements is there is no reason to believe anything he says, right? So he says, let's release the Mueller report, let people see it. But there's no reason, he is sufficiently disconnected from reality that he basically says whatever he thinks will be best for him in the moment. And this creates a big challenge for journalists because he's the president of the United States, and I know some people say, well, just ignore him and ignore his tweets. But he's the president of the United States, and it's not so easy to ignore him, and yet it's also not clear that what he's saying has any particular meaning. As John was saying, it's just this continual need to talk about himself all the time. And look, I'm a New Yorker. I grew up in New York in the 1980s. Donald Trump was a tabloid character back then. He is unchanged. This is the way he was back then. The problem is now he's the president of the United States.
John, what does it mean to you? The president on a 50-tweet tirade this weekend, 30 tweets since the weekend. You make an interesting point. The president, it may not be the strongest economy around, but it's strong enough that he could be touting it. Wages are up. GDP is up. They put out a big report today. Why does he so easily get distracted from something that was so central to his campaign? The folks in rural Ohio might have voted for him because of the fact that he was promising to bring back jobs and to increase manufacturing output. Why does he not stick on that message? What's on his mind that he's getting so off focus this week?
Ali, I don't think he can help it. The president, first of all, the president's under a lot of pressure. The Mueller investigation is closing in. That's one of his obsessions for very good reason. You've got the special counsel investigation, the Southern District of New York, the Attorney General of the state of New York, the Manhattan District Attorney, all honing in on him, his businesses, his foundation, his transition, his family, his campaign aides. So that is a tremendous source of pressure. He's had political setbacks. The Democrats have taken control of the House. They left him naked in that government shutdown and having to capitulate to Nancy Pelosi on his wall. That's not happening. He's not getting the money to build this wall that he promised voters he was going to do. He's launched this trade war with China that it has damaged the U.S. economy as well as China's economy. Now he seems very eager to get a deal, but it's not clear that that deal is going to be anything that changes the growth path of the U.S. economy. So he's coming up short in a lot of areas, and I think that is a source of stress for him on top of the legal problems.
And that's interesting, David, because the fact is the effect of the trade war may be long-term damaging to U.S. growth. So if the president does get a deal, and today, waiting for the Fed to say that they weren't raising interest rates, the market went up for about an hour and then went back down because people are worried that this ongoing trade war and this particular war with China doesn't look like it's coming to an end anytime soon.
That's right, and that is a risk for the economy. I think the bigger problem, it's very easy for us to focus on the immediate numbers and the trade war and this plant in Ohio, but to some extent I think the larger problem is, the economy is not that strong. Yes, wages have grown a little bit over the last couple of years, and unemployment is low, but basically wage growth has been really quite weak for most workers, and that's part of why people are so dissatisfied out in the country. It's been the main trend now in the economy for most workers for most of the last 40 years, and particularly since 2000. And so it is difficult for Trump to try to persuade people that the economy is great when it's just pretty good for most people. It's really good if you own a lot of stock, but for most people it's just sort of pretty good. And as you played in the clip from Jay Powell, the Fed chair, it looks like it's now getting weaker. And so I think there are all kinds of economic risks out there, even if it's impossible to know what route the economy is going to take. It's just not that strong already.
I'm a little puzzled. I don't know if you can see this on TV, but Donald Trump held up a chart like this. I have no idea what he held up in Ohio. He said, "You don't need to know what this is. It's a good line. It's a good number." I don't know what he's talking about. Did you know what that was?
No. I mean, obviously, you could find numbers out there that look like good numbers, right?
Of anything. I could make a chart of anything. There was no labels. There were no words. There were no numbers on the chart. It was just a line.
It was just sort of classic Trump. It was like, here's a scoreboard. I'm going to say it's great. I'm going to say it's big and beautiful, and just take my word for it.
Well, and you couldn't, guys, have a starker contrast than the White House coming out with a budget early this week. And yes. Kevin Hassett, the chief economist in the White House, said the economic growth in 2019 was going to be even higher than it was in 2018. It would be 3.2%. Jay Powell said exactly the opposite today, said that we're going to have 2.1% growth. The second Fed downgrade in growth projections in the last couple of months. There is a very big difference in outcomes between those two forecasts. We're now late in the first quarter that's expected to be below 2% growth. That is another source of pressure on the president. If he loses the what even on its face is a good economy, even if, as David says, for many workers it's not a big increase in their living standards, that is the most significant prop underneath his support that he has.
Hey, David, what do you think is going on with this Kellyanne Conway, George Conway, Donald Trump thing? Kellyanne Conway did speak to Politico today, in which she said she seemed to be taking Donald Trump's side. She said he left it alone for months, talking about Donald Trump out of respect for me. Conway, a senior Trump aide, told Politico in a brief telephone interview. But you think he shouldn't respond when somebody, a non-medical professional, accuses him of having a mental disorder? You think he should just take that sitting down? What do you make of this?
Well, I mean, I guess, look, I don't have a habit of defending President Trump. I've written that I think he's unfit for office, and he is. I will say that this is actually, if we had any president, Barack Obama, George W. Bush, had a senior advisor in the White House whose spouse was basically out there saying all kinds of things about how terrible the president was, it would be a little bit weird for that president, too. And so I have to say, of all the things that I object to with Trump, the idea that he finally responded to one of his senior aides' husband just constantly attacking him, if anything, he showed bizarre restraint.
Enough to know, but we've seen it before. Martha sounding the alarm during Watergate. A lot of people dismissed her as kind of a kook, and she turned out to be raising some significant points.
All right. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Good to see you both, John Harwood and David Leonhardt. Coming up, President Trump expressed confusion today that Robert Mueller would be able to issue a report, even though President Trump won the presidential election. It probably sounds confusing to you. That's because it actually is. The Trump administration is also not cooperating with congressional investigators. Former Justice Department official Neil Katyal joins me next. And reports of disarray in executive agencies, from the Department of Housing to the FAA. Former HUD Secretary and presidential candidate Julian Castro will explain how to combat the reported presidential negligence of the government. And in tonight's Last Word, two major and the late John McCain seem to be the shiny objects that he'd like us to focus on, instead of the looming release of Robert Mueller's final report on his Russia investigation. Today, the president again tried to challenge Mueller's appointment nearly 2 years into the investigation. Now, some of what you're about to hear from the president simply isn't true, and much of it simply doesn't make sense.
I just won one of the greatest elections of all time in the history of this country, and even you will admit that. And now I have somebody writing a report that never got a vote, tens of millions of voters, and now somebody's going to write a report who never got a vote. A man out of the blue just writes a report. I got 306 electoral votes. It's sort of an amazing thing that when you have a great victory, somebody comes in, does a report out of nowhere. Tell me how that makes sense. Who never got a vote, who the day before he was retained to become special counsel, I told him he wouldn't be working at the FBI. And then the following day, they get him for this? I don't think so. I don't think people get it.
All right, so the president has a problem with unelected officials investigating him, but apparently he also doesn't care for congressional committees, which have a constitutional duty to conduct oversight investigating him either. Congressman Elijah Cummings, chair of the House Oversight Committee, says, quote, the White House has refused to hand over any documents or produce any witnesses for interviews, despite numerous requests. Chairman Cummings says that this refusal, quote, reflects a decision at the highest levels to deny congressional oversight altogether. President Trump also welcomed the release of the Mueller report. He welcomed it, despite the possibility that it might further implicate members of Trump world.
Have a right to see the Mueller report? I don't mind. I mean, frankly, I told the House, if you want, let them see it. Let it come out. Let people see it. That's up to the Attorney General. We have a very good Attorney General. He's a very highly respected man.
Public, and in doing so, he might have nixed a major argument against its release. Quote, Justice Department guidelines prohibit revealing information about people who are not being indicted, and that is obtained by a grand jury. But the reason that information generally is not released is to protect the people involved. And the most high-ranking person involved, Trump, just gave it the green light. Other figures in the probe who have not been indicted may still object to details of their conduct being aired publicly, but now it would seem Trump has authorized the disclosure of detail about his own conduct. Joining us now, Neil Katyal, former acting U.S. Solicitor General in the Obama administration. Neil wrote the special counsel regulations under which Robert Mueller was appointed, which makes me wonder, Neil, as I listened to the president earlier today, where he said he has just won the greatest election of all time in the history of this country, 306 electoral votes. So how could a guy just come out of the blue and investigate him?
Yeah, so Trump lies about things that are both big and small. On the small, it's not just that he didn't win the greatest election in history, 306 electoral votes. He didn't even win 306, he won 304. So he can't even get the smallest details right. And then the big ones, the idea that Mueller is just some dude on the street who just writes a report. Mueller was appointed by Trump's own guy, Rod Rosenstein. Rod Rosenstein was put into the job by Donald Trump. So the idea that it's some man off the street or something like that, of course not. And then the most corrosive thing, the idea the president says nobody voted for Mueller and millions of people voted for me. I mean, there's nothing more corrosive and anti-democratic and a fundamental betrayal of our Anglo-American heritage and legal heritage for 500 years. I mean, the idea is that no person is above the law. And just because you were elected, that doesn't put you above the law. And by the way, it's an argument he should fear, because it turns out there are some people who are elected. They're called members of Congress, and they are now going to get into this investigation big time. And I don't think the president will be very happy about those elected officials and what they're about to investigate.
One of those people is Elijah Cummings, who said President Trump's actions violate our constitutional fundamental principle of checks and balances. If our committee must resort to issuing subpoenas, there should be no doubt about why. This has nothing to do with presidential harassment and everything to do with unprecedented obstruction. But I wonder, Neil, from listening to the president today, whether this is a game in which he believes his base or his supporters will play, or whether he has a fundamental misunderstanding of the fact that because he won an election, it doesn't prevent a report being written about him, an investigation taking place about him, and that Special Counsel Robert Mueller isn't a guy off the street.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump really does show that he believes that this Constitution is all a game, and it's just subject to rhetoric and being disregarded and the like. And I think Representative Cummings is exactly right. The most important duty he has as a member of Congress is to stand up and be a check and balance. I mean, that is the genius that Madison and Hamilton and Jay and others gave us in 1787. The idea that no matter who the president is, no matter how wise that person may be, they have to be subject to checks and balances, and chief among them is the role of Congress.
You know, one of the things Adam Schiff was talking about, he told NBC News that he wants to investigate whether Trump or those around him might be compromised by a foreign government. Now, one of the points that Adam Schiff is making is that we can get obsessed about Donald Trump pre-election and what he may have done to get elected, and those appear to be the things in which he is alleged to be involved are actual crimes for which Michael Cohen has been found guilty. That said, there are concerns about what Donald Trump is doing as president or under what influence he may be as president. Adam Schiff seems to be indicating that from the House Intel Committee perspective, they're more interested in that.
Yeah, so I think Schiff's on to something really important. As we await, as the nation awaits the Mueller report, I think it's important for everyone to know Mueller's mandate is a criminal mandate and sometimes a counterintelligence mandate, but it's not going to get into all the stuff about whether Trump lied about the Russians, for example, in 2016 when he said he had no business dealing with the Russians. It could conceivably get into it, but it's likely not to, because lying to the American public while...
Other individuals likely to be sent requests include former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and Gary Cohn, an investment banker who served as Mr. Trump's top economic advisor until he stepped down 1 year ago. Neil, there is going to be no stone left unturned by this Congress. So if there's anything that Donald Trump's been up to, there won't be a place to hide.
I hope that's right, because, you know, for 2 years, Congress sat on its hands and did nothing to investigate Trump. And, you know, this is someone who has repeatedly defied federal law. Just, you know, one example, that Gary Cohn questionnaire that the Judiciary Committee is sending. Gary Cohn, who was revealed 2 weeks ago, complained about the fact that President Trump tried to block the Time Warner merger with AT&T because he was so upset by the coverage on your rival network on CNN. That is a blatant abuse of power. Again, it might not be criminal, but it is exactly the kind of thing our founders wrote the impeachment clause all about. And so, again, as we think and await the Mueller report, I think the most important thing is to understand it's only limited to crimes. It's not limited to these other things. And that's why you see House Judiciary Chairman Nadler stepping up and saying, I got to investigate this stuff.
Neil, as always, thank you for joining me. Neil Katyal. All right, coming up next, presidential candidate Secretary Julian Castro on the president's apparent refusal to cooperate with investigators and his attack on Robert Mueller. And later, the Trump administration keeps losing policy fights that it should have won. And reports say it keeps losing because of poor planning and even incompetence. This week, President Trump has ramped up his already prolific Twitter usage. He tweeted more than 50 times over the weekend and has already sent more than 30 tweets since the week began. 31, I think. He's just sent a new one. As the president continues to make the most of his executive time, the day-to-day work of actually running the country seems to be falling by the wayside. More than 2 years into his presidency, there are 152 Senate-confirmed positions for which Donald Trump has not even bothered to nominate anyone to fill the role. Just this week, after the deadly malfunction in the Boeing 737 MAX crisis, the president finally got around to appointing someone to run the Federal Aviation Administration. And after failing to find a replacement for former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly, the White House is reportedly planning to drop the word acting from acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Mulvaney is still doing that job in addition to his other job, important job, by the way, as the head of the Office of Management and Budget. This week, we learned there are even bigger staffing problems in the Trump administration. Some of Trump's appointees, who've actually been confirmed by the Senate, are apparently taking their cues on how to do their job from President Trump. On Monday, NBC News reported that Housing and Urban Development Secretary Ben Carson has kept a relatively light work schedule while running the agency. A list of Carson's appointments over a 31-week period in 2017 shows that he held one senior staff meeting a week and spent half of his Fridays either leaving early or taking the day off altogether so he could fly to his mansion in Florida for the weekend. Sound like anyone you know? I'm joined now by someone who actually knows what it takes to run the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Julian Castro was HUD secretary from 2014 to 2017. He's currently the only former head of a federal agency running for president. And prior to that, he was the mayor of San Antonio. Secretary Castro, good to see you. Thank you for being with us.
Hey, great to be with you, Ali.
I want to go through a bunch of policy things, but I want to tell you the Associated Press is reporting now that the Prime Minister of New Zealand has announced an immediate ban on all assault weapons, military-style, semi-automatic weapons. It took them under a week to do that.
It is amazing, isn't it? I'm glad to see that. Those are weapons of war. I don't think that they have any place out there on the streets. I believe the United States should reinstate an updated assault weapons ban. Probably the most shameful moment in Congress over the last decade was right after the tragedy at Newtown, when President Obama implored Congress to do something on common sense gun reform. Even something as straightforward and as supported by 90% of the American public as universal background checks. And the Republican-controlled Congress did not lift a finger, even though more than 24 children had died. What we see in New Zealand tonight is something very different and positive. I believe that though we need to get to a point where enough politicians, especially Republican ones, are willing to stand up to groups like the NRA and to pass common sense gun reform, universal background checks, limiting the capacity of magazines, and an assault weapons ban.
Secretary Castro, I want to ask you about a topic that you and other candidates have been talking about this week, and that is about the Electoral College. There are a number of people, a number of states in this country, a number of people in this country who think the system needs reforming. Elizabeth Warren has said that she thinks we should get rid of the Electoral College. Beto O'Rourke has said that it makes some Americans feel like their votes don't really count. Pete Buttigieg says it's got to go because people in his conservative state don't count in some elections. Where do you stand on this?
No, I agree. I believe that it should be abolished. It's an anachronism. And by the way, as folks may remember, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, who ran against each other in 2016, at different points had called for doing away with the Electoral College. We've had two people now who won the popular vote in the last 20 years who did not become president. And a lot of times folks will say, well, the Electoral College protects especially these small states. Presidential candidates won't get out to some of the smaller states if we don't keep it. I've pledged to visit all 50 states, and I know that some of the other candidates have pledged to visit all 50 states during this campaign. I was in Idaho and Utah, two states that are some of the smaller states in our union. And so it just shows you that that doesn't mean, even if you did away with the Electoral College, that people are not going to visit or go campaign or ask for the vote, the support of folks who live in some of these smaller states. They're going to go everywhere. We're going to go everywhere during this campaign.
I want to talk to you about the Supreme Court. The Hill has reported that one idea talked up by both Beto O'Rourke and Pete Buttigieg would reform the Supreme Court so that Republicans appointed 5 justices and Democrats appointed 5 justices. The 10 justices would then mutually agree on an additional 5, bringing the total number on the court to 15. Donald Trump's already says he thinks that's a terrible idea. What do you think?
Well, of the different ideas that have been proposed, the one that intrigues me the most is something like term limits, even if they were long terms. Something that balances it out by partisanship, I think also could make sense. What I wouldn't want to see happen is just a straight increase in the number of justices without reforming how the appointments are done, because the problem with that is that you could raise the number to 11 next year, and then 10 years from now, the other party could try and raise it to 15 so that they can have their president appoint several new justices. So my preference would be for us to remain at 9 and do it the way that we've been doing it. But of the different proposals that have been out there, I think I would be most open to something that looks at term limits.
Let me ask you just your thoughts at this point in the race. How do you feel you're doing, and what do you think Americans need to know about you?
Well, I think that we're steadily building momentum, and I'm going out there, visiting these early states. I can tell that when I get in front of folks that I've gained a lot of traction. I've also pledged to visit all 50 states. I was in Idaho and Utah, like I said, because I believe that everybody counts. That's the reason that I went out to Puerto Rico right after I announced. You know, folks have asked, well, you know, how do you feel about the fact that you're not a front runner right now? And I point out two things. Number one, that there are 46 weeks until the Iowa caucus, right? But who's counting? There's a long time. And then secondly, you know, I was not born, nor did I grow up a front runner. I can't think of a single time in my life when I've been a front runner at something, but I have been successful because I'm going to put in the hard work of going to speak to Americans everywhere. And there are a lot of folks in this country right now who don't feel like a front runner. I'm going to go and talk to them, and I'm going to make sure that they hear my message that what we need to do is to create the smartest, the healthiest, the fairest, and most prosperous nation on earth. I'm also one of the few candidates in this race, and you know, you pointed out that I'm the only one who has actually run one of the federal agencies. I have executive experience. I have a track record of getting things done and a very compelling vision for the future of the country. And you know, I may not be ahead right now, but I'm confident that by the time February 3rd, 2020 rolls around, when Iowa caucuses, that I will be.
It is a worthy enterprise, and we thank you for participating in it. Secretary Julian Castro, good to talk to you again.
Thanks a lot.
All right, coming up, the Trump administration is racking up a record number of record losses in a way that you haven't heard of, and it's caused mostly by incompetence. I'll tell you about that next.